Hi there. Thank you so much for coming back and welcome to Sean Cameron Photographic. Now tell me something. Who doesn't want a decent portrait lens in their bag? Now I tend to use this. It's a Nikon 85mm f.4. It normally goes on my D850 and gives pretty spectacular results. It can also go on my Z6 using the FTZ adapter and it's just as flipping good. The f1.8 version is also pretty impressive, but I prefer the extra oomph I get with the 1.4. I like my subjects to literally leap out of the picture. And this does that for me. It's a fantastic piece of kit. But not everybody wants to stump up at least 1,300 quid for a lens, especially if they're not going to use it that much. I mean, even second hand you'd still need to part with at least 700 to maybe 1,000. For the Z6, Z7 series, the most logical lens is the Nikon Z 85mm f1.8s. Now that retails for £700, so about the same price as a second hand one of these. And it's rumoured to be very, very sharp indeed. Now, somebody described it as Nikon's most complicated lens, which worries me a little. I don't want complicated, particularly, you see, because that's like saying it works, but just don't shut the door too hard. And for goodness sake, put your bag down gently. I don't want something to be classed as complicated and to make that its top selling point. I want reliable. Anyway, I hope to get one soon and I will of course review it. Now if you've got a limited budget, then maybe you could hold out for a used model of that, but I can't see them happening anytime soon, to be quite honest, because it was only released last September. So what's the alternative? Is there an alternative? Of course there's an alternative. There's always an alternative. And this time there's two. And they are the Veltrox and the Samyang. And I'm going to do a short couple of tests with them. So firstly, let's take a look at them. Which one shall I look at first? I know, the Veltrox. Okay, what can I say about the Veltrox? Well, it's an f1.8 lens, and yes, I know what I've just said about the f1.4, but the impressions are that it's a decent weight. It's actually 540 grams. And it's made mainly of metal. And I can tell that's because it's actually quite cold, but also because I checked the specs on Veltrox, on the Veltrox site. It's comfortingly solid. The focus ring is definitely plastic. I don't know whether you can hear that. And there's no buttons for manual AF or stabilisation. There is, however, this very fancy orange sign. And there's no clip on the sunshade. And in my experience, that probably means I'm going to have to spend a lot of time picking it up off the floor. But I'm really hoping to be proven wrong. But all in all, I'm quite impressed by the 10 elements in 7 groups worth of weight this has. And the build is pretty solid, as I say. And if that gives a clue to its performance, then we are looking good. Now the minimum focus distance is the same as the Nikon Z 85mm at 80 centimeters, which is just over 2.5 feet in old money. And talking of money, it cost me a mere £336. So that's not much, is it? Now there's one odd addition that few people seem to notice, and that's this little micro USB port at the base. Now I'm guessing this is for updates. In fact, I believe that you could use it to get f1.6, but I'm not going to do that because it's not an official firmware upgrade. You could do it if you want to. I'm not endorsing it. Let's have a look at the Samyang. Now that feels surprisingly a little bit heavier. Now it could be because it's an f1.4 against the f1.8 of the Veltrox. It's got one more glass element, which makes 11. And apparently it's still lighter than its Nikon rival. It retails at about £289 to £320, which could be an absolute steal if it's as good as they say it is. Now, the only downside, and yes, there had to be one, this is a manual only lens. Yes, I know they still exist. The aperture is controlled old style by what we used to call, conveniently, the aperture ring. Simpler times. Now the focus ring feels really good, with a decent amount of resistance, which should make it pretty positive. And of course it needs to, because it's a manual lens. Apparently it is weather sealed, so we don't need to worry too much if it rains. And I couldn't find too much information on the Veltrox, to be absolutely frank with you. The site didn't translate all too well into English, but I won't criticise them because they still do better English than any attempt I might make at Cantonese. So I just couldn't find much about it. That's the bottom line. I thought the easiest way to compare these two is to use the new COVID opening up rules. I thought I'd meet my videographer in his garden and his son to take some kind of natural shots of family together. The type of shots that you guys would want to make in the summer months. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, hang on a minute, how can I test these? Because one's manual and one's autofocus, so the Samyang isn't at a disadvantage. Well, there is a little trick called focus peaking. This is when the camera detects the edges of an object and then lights them up in a colour of your choosing. Now the only hitch to this is normally it's done via the rear screen, which to be honest is an absolute pain. But with the mirrorless Z6, however, I can actually use it through the viewfinder. So I'm going to be using an Atomos so you can actually see what I see too. Now, the one thing I would say is about a portrait lens is that the speed of focus may not be the most important thing, but sharpness and clarity are. And that's what we will be judging the Samyang on. Now, the Samyang doesn't focus quite as closely as the Veltrox. Minimum focusing distance is 1.1 meters. But I tell you what, that's still 900 centimeters closer than we're legally allowed to get anyway. And who wants to get any closer? I'm also going to test the two lenses versus my normal 85 f1.4. And I'm going to use the D850 to test it. Now come on, I want you to tell me if you can really tell the difference between them, because I'm really intrigued by it. Now, of course, these 85mm lenses are not just restricted to the realms of the portrait photographer. They can also be used for candid and street photography. Now, I've got a show coming up, and I thought I'd see how it goes. And I'd test them all at the show. So that's two tests we're doing. Let's see how they went. Now, of course, the 85mm lens isn't just restricted to the realm of the portrait photographer. The lenses can also be used for candid and street photography. Now, with this in mind, I dragged myself out of bed the other day, got to my next shoot really early to photograph Rachel, the show organiser, setting up for the day's competition. So with her permission, of course, I used the opportunity to test both lenses, kind of in a replica street candid situation. So let's see how I got on. Now, photography with the manual Samyang proved quite tricky mainly because Rachel moved so quickly from job to job that I couldn't get the focus right. But it was still just about doable. I did miss a lot of shots though. The combination of the f1.4 that I wanted to test that gives that narrow depth of field and manual focus meant that quite a few images were just plain out of focus. I found the easiest way was to start tracking before I wanted to take the shot. On the other hand, the Veltrox never missed a beat. And using the Z6 face and eye tracking, well, to be honest, it made catching those moments almost too easy. I'm only showing the 7 images for each lens, but in reality, the Veltrox gave me far more usable images. Even though the Veltrox is only f1.8, Rachel stands out from the background really well. Compared to the Samyang, the images are sharper and more defined. These were all shot in RAW, and the only adjustments I've made are standard sharpening, contrast and a touch of clarity. They're not far from being straight out of the camera. Now, starting with the manual Samyang, we have the portrait style shots. You know, the type of photos you'd be taking at family gatherings and the like. As I'm not allowed to be in the studio with someone outside my household at present, and anyway, who has a handy studio set up for when the folks pop over? So the great outdoors it is. You can see the focus peaking in action here. I've got it set to red and high sensitivity. As the focus ring is turned, different edges light up. Now, in the world of f1.4, you have to remember that the eyes are set back from the fringe, so having just that lit up may not be enough. And as we know, the eyes have to be in focus even if nothing else is. Once again, these raw images have been edited very sparingly, with just the sharpening, contrast and clarity. You know these glorious few minutes as the sun is setting and we call it the golden hour? Well, that was when we did these. The red warmth of the sun played havoc with my video, but I think you can see enough to get the idea. The longer I worked, the more I got used to using focus peaking. Frustratingly, the thing I wanted to concentrate on seemed to be the one edge that I couldn't see, the eyelids. Of course, it didn't help that I had him virtually staring into the sun, so his eyes were shut. What a rookie error. As you can see, I'm hiding absolutely nothing. I'm showing the good and the bad shots as they happened. The focus ring was as positive as I hoped it would be, and so I enjoyed the feel of using it. But as the sun rapidly descended, it was time to change to the Veltrox. As before, the Veltrox gave me a lot more in focus hits and let me grab the moments as they happened. I'm not expecting you to count them, but there are actually 45 images compared to the 22 that I managed with the Samyang in roughly the same amount of time. I was far more able to do the second most important thing in portraiture, and that's engaging with your subject. With the focus largely doing its own thing, I was able to concentrate on getting the best from him. The Veltrox also allowed the Z6 face detection to work well, although eye detection barely seemed to make an appearance. Both lenses felt good to use, but the Veltrox gives 15mm away in length to the Samyang and consequently isn't quite as balanced. That said, the Nikon is the shortest in length, but somehow feels more comfortable due to its weight and general bulk. I want to say girth, but I'm being tactful. All in all, the Veltrox was easy to use and I enjoyed the experience with both lenses. The focus ring on both lenses is perfectly placed and equally comfortable to use. They are what I would describe as pointable, in that they make it easy to frame the image with no searching around. Both lenses appear bright and clean through the viewfinder, though that could be a false impression given that it's digital rather than optical, of course. Even both lens hoods stayed put, so there was no wasting time picking them up from the floor, or to be more precise, the casual kick to the side that I'd normally employ. By the time I picked up my trusty D850, with my even trustier 85mm, the sun had given its best. And as I'm sure you just want to see the images, let's compare the three lenses side by side. After all, let's not forget that I did say that I was going to judge the Samyang on the quality of the images and not the manual focus. Looking at the three images here, which do you think is which? Yes, they're all different, but is that due to the lens, the camera, or the rapidly changing light? Well, I think it's a combination of all three, but if you eliminate the camera and the light variations, then concentrate on the detail, the sharpness, and the bokeh, are you surprised by the results? Or perhaps they're what you expected? Well, were you right? What about this one? Which lens produced what image? Now, for total disclosure, finding myself in the unusual position of needing to manually focus, well, it clearly distracted me enough to shoot at 800 ISO for no other apparent reason than pure incompetence. When I came to change to the Veltrox, I had to keep that setting for fair balance. Just bear in mind, please, that the camera was occasionally overexposing with the larger Samyang aperture. If you are wondering why I didn't use the Nikon lens on the Z6, well, partly time, but my plan was to compare the images from the two cheaper lenses with what I would consider to be my ultimate portrait setup, and that's with the D850. It's only when you crop right in that the difference starts to be apparent. The Samyang is consistently softer than both the Nikon and, more importantly, the Veltrox, which actually appears to be the sharpest and clearest in this set. And finally these. Did that surprise you? Nah, it's these really. I just wanted to see if you were paying attention. I hope you enjoyed that. Now, I know I sound like I'm greatly favouring the Veltrox, but in fact I found both did the job really well based on these results that you've seen. But they're so different. In the distant past, when I used manual lenses seriously, it was with the assistance of focusing screens. Anybody remember focusing screens? Now, focus peaking is an ingenious idea, but somehow it doesn't seem to give me the same confidence the focusing screens used to. But to be honest, I probably felt the same when I was handed my first ever autofocus lens. Now, back to today. Not all the lenses were equally sharp, especially when I cropped in. But how often would you normally print that large unless you were doing a huge canvas? To be honest, I think the conclusion has to be that if you want a really decent lens for a great price and don't mind manual focus, then the Samyang is a great prospect. If you prefer to have an AF lens, then I can recommend the Veltrox quite comfortably. If, however, your heart's set on a Nikon, whatever the cost, then as far as the 85mm 1.4S, I couldn't be any more in favour. In any event, none of the lenses I've tested here will disappoint you. I hope that helped in some small way. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me, and if you enjoyed this and you liked it, then you know what I'm going to say. Don't forget to click the like button. And if you really, really liked it, why don't you try on that subscribe button? You know it'll suit you. Thank you so much again for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye.